giving you a voice,
making it loud our own way.
Welcome to the fun.
Our next stop on our FRC international journey for this evening is we're going to head off to China and see what's going on there. I don't know how many of you have read Frank Merrick's latest blog post about the situation in China. Hey, Goddard, be quiet. But basically, all three FRC regionals in China have been canceled this year. The Chinese Ministry of Education basically introduced this new requirement for any organization that wants to host a tournament for students, any sort of competition, basically requiring them to be approved by the Chinese government ahead of time. This is sort of in line with their socioeconomic policies, and obviously I'm going to not try to get into too much of that, but our producer Tyler did sit down with Howard Cohen, who's the lead robot inspector for FIRST in China, and they had a lot of healthy discussion over this. So let's take a look at that video, and we will come back and discuss more in just a minute.
Our next topic coming up, we're going to be talking here to Howard Cohen and talking about some of the events that have happened in China coming up. And Howard is the lead inspector in China. Of course, Howard, you're from the States, so is that right?
Yeah, that is true. I do not live in China.
No, but a lot of experience in China. And you and I actually got to hang out in China for a while. A couple of years ago, we were at some awesome off-season events and workshops. Do you mind talking a little bit about that first before we get into really what has happened in China?
So in China, we host a off-season called CRC, and now more recently RCC, China Robotics Challenge and Region China Champions. And it's really kind of a party, really. We get to play robots one more time. A lot of the teams kind of pull out a lot of stops, try really new things, and try to train people and show people what FIRST really is about there in China.
Yeah, and a lot of the international teams, or in regards to China, different international teams with teams from the States, Australia, Brazil, all over, get to come in and essentially show them what FIRST is about, like you said, and get to work with them hand in hand. So it's kind of a cool mentorship program. So I want to bring that up first because there's a lot of people I don't think really know what's going on in China, which we'll fill in a little bit, but there's a lot of other cool things that is making FIRST truly a global program in China as well. So let's move on. The main thing we want to talk about today, of course, was the update that was posted in Frank's blog back on October 17th in regards to, unfortunately, I'm just going to read this off here. It says, in September, to create greater equity among students, the Chinese Ministry of Education introduced new requirements for organizations wishing to host FIRST student competition. So long story short, that means there's been some changes, and now there's not going to be any FRC competitions in China. Can you kind of break that down a little bit for us on essentially what that means and how it happened and how we kind of got to the spot, Howard?
So the Ministry of Education is trying to do some more things to be a little more proactive in China. And some of the things that we have to do now is that we have to work with a national NGO within China to submit for event approvals.
What's an NGO?
So it's like creating a nonprofit over there. And it's kind of like if you wanted to go get your driver's license, you need to keep going to different people to get more and different various approvals, while at the same time being able to identify yourself at each step.
Sure.
Some of the other rules are kind of common sense rules that if your team wants to travel outside of the United States, your school has to get permission, or your team has to get permission from the school. And then you also need to provide that proof that you got that permission to the ministry.
So looking at essentially how that leads up. So as mentioned in the blog, this happened in September, so it's a very quick turnaround for something like that. So it leads to no events in 2019. So what's going to have to happen essentially for next season, for the 2020 season? What sort of compliance has to happen? We just have to work with a nonprofit there? Or can you explain that a bit more?
So kind of like how we have MAR or New England, we would be essentially forming something like that in China. And it would be the entity that host those competitions. Something that we're going to do is, unfortunately for this season, we won't have our 3 regionals, but we're really hoping that, 2020, we have those regionals and we're kind of back to normal.
Well, and one thing I mentioned too is you said 3 regionals. China's been growing crazy the last couple of years.
One regional every year.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I'm expecting 4 by the time China comes back in 2020. Minnie, if you're listening to this, who's one of the RDs there, we're looking for 4 out of you for 2020. So for the teams let's talk about first, I want to talk about the teams in China and then the teams who are maybe going to the regionals there. For the teams that are in China that were going to regionals in China, what has happened to them? Are all the teams going to be able to go to a competition still, or what are some teams doing? What are maybe some other teams doing? What are their options?
So we tried to work with each team to figure out were they able to go outside of China and compete, and if they are, where can they go? And we also told the teams to try to respect the caps at each event. So if they see that this event is full, well, why not try another event that has maybe 10 slots that are open? We tried to get every team one of their first picks, if not their first pick. And then we also tried to do this right before second round selection so that teams outside of China had the same opportunity to get to the events they wanted as well.
So the me is quite interesting because you talk about how there's so many teams where locally here in the States, if they have to go out of state, that's a problem sometimes. These teams need to go out of the country to go in their event. Do you know about like what percentage of teams or approximately how many teams were able to actually get to another event so far?
Quite a few teams are looking to go out. We're looking at about half right now. I suspect a little bit more as we go on. And for teams who really want to know, they could probably search all of them on TBA or on First to see where everyone's going.
I know I'm putting on a spot to the randomly awesome statistics. So, what about teams who were going to events in China who are not from China but we're going to events in China? Do they get like an automatic slot somewhere else, or is that just kind of like, hey, if you can find a place that's good for you?
So we were doing essentially the same thing. So Poland 5883 Spice Gears, they were going to go to China, and we were able to move them into Hawaii.
Okay. And kind of the last thing I want to wrap up with this is as mentioned before, China is an area that we've seen tremendous growth out of, and this is obviously a frustrating for all. It's not like, it's just like, oh, what did First do wrong? This is frustrating for First, right? This is frustrating for everybody that they're not able to keep this going. So what are you doing, or what is China doing, or First in China doing to continue growth through the programs, or is it kind of a treading water standpoint right now? And then are we going to see, do you know anything about in regards to other international areas? Is First going to try to do anything to make sure we're truly up to speed or up to par on something like this in case this happens anywhere else?
So for us in China, we're really trying to continue just as if everything else was going on. We just won't have the regionals. We're still going to work with teams to translate the manual. We're going to still work with teams to answer their questions where they have them. And what we really want to try to tell kind of the global First community is that if this was an easy thing, or if this was a simple yes, no, we wouldn't be in this situation. We would never have made up. This would have just been handled. But these are really hard times that we're going through, and we're hoping that we'll have our off season this year. So 2019 off season, and then we just continue on as normal.
Well, Howard, I want to thank you first off for all your efforts that you've done helping First in China. I've had an opportunity to see that firsthand, and it is truly amazing to see the awesome growth going on in really all of our international areas that we're starting to see. And I think there's not nearly enough awareness of what's going on with those areas. And the way that China's been growing, I can only hope that you guys can just pick up where you were, because there's a lot to pick up to keep moving forward and just keep doing great things in China. So thank you for everything you've done there. And the last thing I want to ask you, Howard, as we wrap up here, any tips for those who might be traveling to China either with or without a First team?
If you're bringing tools, make sure your batteries are carried on and your drills are in your checked-in luggage.
And to add on to that, if you do have any teams that are coming from China to one of the two championships, in this case, I believe China is going to Houston. Is that correct?
Yeah, Houston.
So they need help in regards to a lot of those supplies because they can't bring them into the States. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are some things that are really hard to get there. And little things like robot carts just make huge differences for them. Batteries make huge differences because you may get 2 batteries from spare parts, but they may not be the best batteries for competition, let alone charging them.
So you heard it from Howard. If you're looking for ways to help out a First team, we'll be talking about chairmans just a little bit and some of those changes there. There's a great opportunity for you. Howard, thank you so much for taking the time. Wish you best luck with helping out with China, and thanks for everything you do for First.
Take care, guys.
Our next
Hey, Alan, we just heard Howard's comments there. So let's talk about China and beyond. As political and socio-economical relations changes between our countries, and when you think about First outside of the U.S., what can First really do to live up to be an international program, and how do they deal with issues like the ones that have been presented?
So yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone has a specific answer to that. But I will say that I've been to China. I went to the CRC in 2015, so I've met a lot of these teams, and I do feel really bad that you're taking at least 2 regionals worth of teams away from possibly not being able to compete this season, right? You have people who just like if you took away my senior year of robots, I would have been really upset. So I get why teams are really upset, and I get why they're trying to find other places where they can compete and they can find a way to do this because they are passionate about it. So whatever they can do to make it work, I would think that first would be trying to move mountains. We haven't really seen that from the back end. We've seen this one note that says they're not doing events, and they're kind of just letting everybody else be on their own. From what I can tell, is get in where you can, find spots at other events.
And so I guess a question that I have, and Garrison, maybe you can take this one for those of you who don't know, Garrison works for Vex. He's a Vex engineer. In China, VRC events and Vex IQ events are still running. They had a national championship just this past weekend in China. So why are these events allowed to run, but first events aren't? Do you have any sort of insight for us?
Yeah, so I'm talking again just as basically an associate of Vex here. I don't really have anything to do with running the events or anything. I talk to the people that do, but in talking with the Vex people, basically it comes down to a couple of things. One is China's big problem with this is that with First is when they pay a registration fee, like we talked about earlier, most of that money goes back to First HQ in Manchester. That really is sort of what makes the government upset. Is $5,000 leaving China mainland going over to the U.S. In Vex's case, that's not happening for a couple of reasons. One is IFI is also incorporated in China. We have IFI Shenzhen, so that's actually where their registration fee goes. And we have a much longer history, in China and dealing with the Chinese government and participating with them. Vex is real. I don't want to talk about this too much, but Vex is honestly much more internationally friendly than FRC in a lot of ways, and that's one of them. Is sort of
going back historically to the very first Vex Worlds in 2008. It was won by 3 Chinese teams. So that was from the very beginning. China's been a huge part of the Vex Robotics competition and a dominant influence. If you look through the STEM Hall of Fame, which is Vex's version of the first Hall of Fame. There's just Chinese team after Chinese team after Chinese team. So there's another issue that's been brought up in chat by a few people, and so right now, First is doing everything they can to accommodate these Chinese teams as I think they should, but there's definitely been some grumblings now. For example, in certain regions where Chinese teams are getting into events which people thought were full, and now local teams aren't getting in, and so sorry, I think I cut out there, but what I was just saying is the 3 of us are all in districts, but Alan and Garrison, and we'll go to Alan first, if you were in a regional system and you couldn't get into your desired local event, either as a first or a second play, how would you feel about a Chinese team getting in?
Right. I mean, you're not going to be, I understand why there's frustration, but I would try to do what I could to be able to go to another event, right? If that means that I have to travel, if I'm a California team and we have to go to Idaho to allow a team from China to come to a California event, maybe that's something we can try to work through. We can fundraise a little bit more. I'm not necessarily happy about it. Or if we only have to do a 1 event season, I mean, that's all I pretty much ever did in high school was a 1 event season because there was only the Lone Star Regional in Texas. We didn't have anything like that back then. So we've got a lot more events now, so teams can be happy about it. But I get why teams are frustrated. I understand it.
Yeah. I haven't heard of any teams not getting into, their first, on the first round choice because, a Chinese team, I until I hear a story of somebody having to go a few hundred miles just to get their first play that's outside of China. I'm also a little surprised First isn't doing more to remedy the situation. And I know we're also going to talk about this later, but yeah, it comes down to First doesn't have enough spots for the number of teams they have. For everybody to do what they want to do and go to the number of tournaments. And we're going to talk about this more when we get to the chairman stuff later. They are trying to get the program to grow faster and faster with no foreseeable plan as far as making more events or, switching people over to districts quicker. I haven't seen a reasonable plan of sustainable growth, event wise. Team wise, they put stuff out all the time. We get into the problem of these Chinese teams are coming over here because they want to compete, which they should. They've worked for 3 years, on off seasons. Alan, you're saying you were in CRC back in 2015. They've been working basically at getting these regionals. They had Shenzhen regional last year for the first time. This is not just like a new thing, like out of the air that China existed and suddenly it didn't. Like China has been working really, really hard, and it's kind of a shame, really, that they're not going to have districts, or I mean, not have regionals this year. I'm pretty upset about it.
So a really good comment in chat that I think touches on the economics of this issue. So another counterpoint, if we're so convinced that a $5,000 registration fee is too high, then why are we running out of spots at events? Teams are clamoring to spend an extra $5,000 for another event. And so there's an economic issue here in first, where there are plenty of teams who would pay, like if you said, hey, you can pay $10,000 and you're guaranteed the 2 events like that you want, like $10,000 for each of them, you're guaranteed. There are teams out there who would pay. And it's just kind of like what happens sometimes in the healthcare system, where there are people who will absolutely pay above and beyond what things would cost just because they want to jump the line. However, you've got to be careful with that sort of thinking, because that is the goal here shouldn't be to just, try and rake in as much money as possible. The goal here is to try and get as many high schools involved. So I understand that point, but the line of thinking is kind of dangerous. And the whole first isn't trying to run as this pure capitalistic environment. It's trying to create accessibility. So there's a sort of an issue there, but that's something that's totally different. But it was really good comment in chat there. And I think sometimes it's really important to try and think of the underlying economics behind these issues and where the normal free market applies and where it doesn't. But I think that's enough for the international stuff tonight. And I just want to say, good luck to our friends in Israel and China. We hope as many of you can compete and, have a season, and the students to have a great experience, and then make some of you to make it to Houston and that. But just know that if you aren't feeling supported out there, we support you. We think you're great. We want to give you metric stuff. So something.
Thank you to all of our co-executive producers, keeping fun loud, live, and independent. Pledge your support at patreon.com/first updates now.